Right now, somewhere in your city, there's a chain-link fence along an abandoned rail yard where crimson-stemmed amaranth is pushing through gravel 6 inches thick. Nobody planted it, nobody waters it. The plant that Aztec emperors considered sacred enough to mix with blood during ceremonies, the one Spanish conquistadors banned on pain of death because controlling a people's food meant controlling their spirit, is growing wild behind a rusted dumpster. And everyone walking past thinks it's trash. Here's what gets strange. NASA studied that same plant as a candidate crop for feeding astronauts on Mars missions because its protein profile is nearly complete. Indigenous peoples across 3 continents cultivated it for millennia. And it's not alone on this list. One plant coming up has more iron than spinach and fed Roman legions on the march. Another is so nutrient-dense that famine relief programs are distributing it right now. Our 20 plants, all edible, all hiding where you've already been looking. You've pulled this plant out of your garden bed 100 times and never once thought to eat it. Lamb's quarters, sometimes called wild spinach, sometimes called fat hen, sometimes called the plant your great-grandmother actually preferred over the spinach you buy in plastic clamshells, is one of the most nutritious leafy greens on the planet. And it grows in disturbed soil like it was designed to follow human civilization around, which, in a way, it was. Chenopodium album has been found in preserved stomach contents of Iron Age bog bodies in northern Europe. Seeds have turned up in archaeological sites across the Americas, China, and the Himalayas. This wasn't a desperation food. This was a chosen food. People cultivated it on purpose across multiple continents and thousands of years. And the reason becomes obvious when you look at the nutrition. According to USDA nutrient data, lamb's quarters contains significantly more vitamin A and calcium than cultivated spinach. More iron, too. The leaves, when you find them, and you will find them because they grow in every temperate zone on Earth, are soft, with a slightly dusty silver-green coating on the underside that feels like fine powder between your fingers. The taste is mild, almost buttery when cooked, without the metallic bite that spinach sometimes carries. You can eat the young leaves raw in salads, steam the mature ones like you'd steam any cooking green, and the tiny black seeds can be ground into flour the way quinoa's cousin should be, because lamb's quarters is literally in the same botanical family as quinoa. Same family. One sells for $8 a pound in health food stores. The other gets ripped out of flower beds and thrown in compost bins. Now, a responsible note here. Like spinach and many other greens, lamb's quarters contains oxalic acid, which means if you're prone to kidney stones or have specific mineral absorption concerns, you'd want to cook it rather than eat massive quantities raw, and you'd want to check with your doctor if you have existing conditions. Cooking reduces oxalic acid significantly. Traditional cultures knew this intuitively. They almost always cooked it. No, but the core reality stands. One of the most nutrient-dense greens ever analyzed by modern science is a plant most people spray with herbicide without a second thought. It grows along garden edges, around compost piles, in the disturbed soil next to driveways and fence lines. Look for diamond-shaped leaves with that distinctive silver-white dusting on the underside, like someone brushed them with flour. The plant can grow waist-high by midsummer, and it produces thousands of seeds, which is part of why it's everywhere. Part of why it survived while cultivated crops came and went. Part of why your ancestors never had to wonder where their next meal of greens was coming from. The wild spinach isn't a backup plan. For most of human history, it was the plan. And you've been composting it. Now let's talk about the one from the hook. The plant an empire tried to destroy. Amaranth, and sometimes called pigweed in the parts of the world that forgot what it was, is a plant with a history so dramatic it sounds invented. The Aztecs didn't just eat amaranth. They built their civilization around it. It was one of the primary tribute crops, as important as maize and beans, and it held deep ceremonial significance. During religious festivals, amaranth seeds were mixed with honey and sometimes sacrificial blood to form figures of gods, which were then consumed as a form of communion. When Hernán Cortés arrived and began systematically dismantling Aztec culture, one of the strategic decisions was banning amaranth cultivation. The reasoning was precisely targeted: destroy the sacred crop, disrupt the food system, break the spiritual backbone. Fields were burned, growers were punished. A grain that had fed millions for centuries was pushed to the margins. But amaranth is not a plant that accepts margins. It survived in wild populations, in remote mountain villages, in the cracks of the colonial system, just as it now survives in the cracks of parking lots and along railway embankments. The plant you see growing wild with those dense, sometimes crimson seed heads and thick stems that glow reddish-purple in late summer light. That's the legacy of a crop that outlasted an attempted cultural erasure, and modern science has confirmed exactly why the Aztecs valued it. Amaranth grain contains complete protein, all essential amino acids, with particularly high lysine, which is the amino acid most cereal grains lack. This makes it one of the few plant-based complete protein sources that grows easily in poor soil without irrigation. NASA's Advanced Life Support Program evaluated it as a candidate crop for long-duration space missions for exactly this reason: calorie-dense, protein-complete, resilient. The leaves are edible too. Cooked like spinach, they're rich in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C. In parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, amaranth greens are a daily staple right now, not a novelty. The grain is gluten-free, the leaves are versatile, and the whole plant grows aggressively in heat, drought, and poor soil, conditions that would kill most cultivated crops. It's found in vacant lots, field margins, disturbed roadsides, and yes, sidewalk cracks where seeds found their way years ago. The texture of the leaves is slightly rough, like fine sandpaper, and the seed heads feel dense and grainy when you run your hand along them in autumn. The seeds taste nutty when toasted. An empire tried to erase this plant from human memory, and it grew back through concrete. That's not a weed. That's a survivor carrying 5,000 years of nutritional intelligence in every seed head. And it's the second plant on this list. We're just getting started. Or here's one you've definitely seen and probably never connected to survival. Wood sorrel, those delicate little heart-shaped leaves growing in 3-leaf clusters that everyone mistakes for clover, is one of the most widespread edible wild plants on Earth, and for centuries, it was the difference between getting scurvy and not getting scurvy for people who couldn't access citrus. Oxalis species grow on every inhabited continent. In Ireland, there's a long tradition of eating wood sorrel as a spring green. The Gaelic name seamsog is sometimes confused with shamrock, and some historians argue wood sorrel, not clover, was the original shamrock. In the Andes, indigenous peoples used a related oxalis species as a food crop for its tubers and tangy leaves. In Japan, the plant appears in family crests. Across cultures, the consistent thread is the same. People ate this, valued this, knew this. The flavor is unmistakable. Bite a leaf and you get an immediate bright, lemony tartness, almost electric on the tongue, that comes from oxalic acid, the same compound that gives rhubarb its zing. That tartness is a sensory signature of vitamin C content, and before citrus fruits were globally available, plants like wood sorrel were critical sources of ascorbic acid for communities in northern latitudes and for sailors who foraged at ports of call. The leaves are tender, almost translucent when held to light, are with a texture so delicate they practically dissolve on your palate. The small yellow or pink flowers are edible too, adding that same citrus spark to salads. You'll find wood sorrel in shady spots, under trees, along north-facing walls, in the moist edges of garden beds, in forest understory. It hugs the ground, spreading in patches, and the leaves fold closed at night or in heavy rain like tiny green butterflies tucking their wings. Now, the qualification: that same oxalic acid that provides the pleasant tartness means moderation matters. In large quantities, oxalic acid can affect calcium absorption and stress the kidneys. particularly for people with existing kidney issues. Traditional cultures ate it in normal food quantities, not by the bushel. As a trail snack, a salad addition, a garnish, it's been used safely for centuries. As a sole food source consumed in massive amounts, that's not how anyone historically used it, and it's not what makes sense now. Think of wood sorrel as nature's lemon drop, a bright, accessible, vitamin C-rich accent that grows in the shadiest corners of your yard, free of charge. The lemon drop plant. When you see those heart-shaped leaves in triplicate hiding under a bush, you'll know what you're looking at now. If the last three plants surprised you, this next one is going to shift something. Curly dock, Rumex crispus, and also called yellow dock, is a plant so common along roadsides, in pastures, and at the edges of neglected lawns that most people have literally never looked at it twice. It has long, wavy-edged leaves that curl at the margins like old parchment, and in late summer it sends up tall, rust-brown seed stalks that rattle in the wind. Touch the leaves and they feel leathery, substantial, with pronounced veins running the length like structural ribbing. The root, when you pull it, and it comes up thick, yellow-orange inside like a turmeric cousin. Smells faintly earthy and tannic. This plant was iron medicine before iron supplements existed. In European folk traditions stretching back centuries, curly dock root was one of the primary remedies for what they called tired blood, anemia. Appalachian herbalism carried this knowledge directly from European settlers into American mountain communities, where dock root tea or syrup remained a spring tonic well into the 20th century. The Cherokee and other indigenous peoples of eastern North America had their own traditions with dock species, using leaves and roots for various purposes, including digestive support. The iron content is real and documented. Curly dock is notably high in iron and vitamin C, and the vitamin C matters because it dramatically improves iron absorption, meaning the plant essentially packages its own enhancement. The young leaves are edible as cooked greens, though they're tart and tannic enough that most traditions recommend changing the cooking water at least once. The seeds, those rust-brown clusters rattling on dry stalks along every highway median in autumn, can be winnowed and ground into a buckwheat-like flour. Traditional herbalists also use the root as what they called an alterative, a slow, steady tonic meant to support the body's eliminative functions over time, and particularly liver and digestive function. Modern research is more cautious here, and evidence for some traditional claims remains primarily ethnobotanical rather than clinical. But the mineral content is confirmed, the edibility is well documented, and the accessibility is undeniable. Curly dock grows in all 50 states, across Europe, and through much of Asia and South America. It thrives in the exact soil conditions humans create: compacted, disturbed, mineral-heavy. You'll find it where you find neglect, which means you'll find it everywhere. The iron weed, growing at the edge of every forgotten pasture, every roadside ditch, every lawn that gave up, carrying the same mineral payload your ancestors used to keep their blood strong through winters without supplements. And nobody's selling it to you because nobody can charge you for what's already at your feet. Now here's where the pattern starts to crystallize. The last plant in this opening act, has a name that sounds like it was born on a battlefield, because it was. Galansoga, commonly called gallant soldier, got its English name through a chain of botanical wordplay that traces directly to wartime. The genus was named after Mariano Martinez de Galinsoga, an 18th-century Spanish botanist. But the plant's explosive spread across Europe happened through the disturbed soils of war, literally following armies, colonizing bomb sites, thriving in the churned earth that conflict left behind. By the mid-20th century, gallant soldier had marched across Europe in the wake of 2 world wars, establishing itself in gardens, farmland, and rubble lots from London to Warsaw. The British, encountering this persistent green invader in their wartime allotments, shortened Galansoga to gallant soldier, half mockery, half grudging respect. But here's what the British gardeners pulling it out never realized. Across the Atlantic, in Colombia, this exact plant is a culinary staple. It's called guasca there, and it's the essential herb in ajiaco, one of the national dishes of Bogotá, a rich chicken soup that tastes incomplete without galanzoga's subtle herbaceous flavor. Colombian markets sell it in bunches. It's not a weed there, it's an ingredient. The leaves are small, soft, and slightly hairy with a delicate texture between your fingers. Nothing aggressive about the feel. The taste is mild, faintly green, as with none of the bitterness or tartness of many wild greens. It cooks down gently into soups and stews. Nutritionally, galanzoga offers a decent profile of minerals and vitamins common to dark leafy greens, though it hasn't received the same level of detailed nutritional analysis as more commercially significant plants. What makes it remarkable isn't a single standout nutrient, it's the accessibility combined with the cultural contrast. In one hemisphere, people pay for it and cook family recipes around it. In another, people curse it as an invader and spend weekends pulling it from flower beds. The same plant. Two completely different relationships. And that contrast, that gap between pest and pantry staple, is the entire point of what we've been building in this first act. 5 plants, all edible, all documented across cultures and centuries, all growing within walking distance of where you're sitting right now. And all of them dismissed by the same modern mindset that replaced diverse wild food systems with monoculture rows and plastic-wrapped produce. These plants fed civilizations, armies, famine survivors. They weren't replaced because they failed. They were replaced because industrial agriculture chose differently. The knowledge didn't die. It just went quiet. And we're about to turn the volume way up, because the plants coming next aren't just edible, they're medicinally validated. And things are about to get serious. This is where the list shifts. Everything in Act 1 was edible, real food, growing wild, ignored by modern culture. But now we're crossing into plants that aren't just nutritious. They're pharmacologically active, studied in clinical settings, and carrying compounds that modern researchers are only now catching up to. And the first one is a plant that most of the English-speaking world considers an invasive nightmare. Japanese knotweed, Reinutria japonica, is the plant property owner's dread, the one that can crack foundations and tank real estate values, the one governments spend millions trying to eradicate. In the UK alone, Japanese knotweed costs an estimated hundreds of millions in removal and structural damage annually. It's been called one of the world's worst invasive species. And here's the twist that almost nobody talks about. In Japan, where it originates, people eat it. And they've been eating it for centuries. It's called itadori, literally removes pain. And the young spring shoots, when they emerge reddish-green and asparagus-like from the soil, are harvested, peeled, and prepared as a tart, rhubarb-flavored vegetable, pickled, stir-fried, made into jams. The flavor is genuinely pleasant, bright, tangy, with a crispness that snaps cleanly between your teeth. The stems are hollow, smooth, and speckled with pink-red flecks that look almost decorative. But what caught modern researchers' attention wasn't the flavor, it was the resveratrol. Japanese knotweed root is one of the most concentrated natural sources of resveratrol, the same compound that made red wine famous in cardiovascular health discussions. Resveratrol has been studied extensively for anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties, with research published across dozens of journals examining its effects on cardiovascular markers, cellular health, and inflammatory pathways. One review noted that trans-resveratrol from Polygonum cuspidatum, Japanese knotweed synonym, showed promising activity in multiple preclinical models. Now, it's important to be clear, preclinical models and in vitro studies don't automatically translate to guaranteed human health outcomes. The research is active, not conclusive. But the compound is real, the concentrations are documented, and the traditional Japanese name, removes pain, suggests that people noticed something centuries before gas chromatography existed. The plant itself is unmistakable. Bamboo-like stems that can grow 10 feet tall by midsummer, broad heart-shaped leaves and clusters of tiny white flowers in late summer. Break a stem and it's hollow with clear nodes, and the interior is crisp and moist. It grows along riverbanks, roadsides, railroad embankments, are in disturbed urban sites across North America and Europe. The resveratrol factory, the plant that panics homeowners and feeds Japanese villagers, growing wild and free along every riverbank in the country. And that contrast between invasive threat and documented medicinal food is exactly the kind of perception gap this list is about to blow wide open. Now, slow down for a second and look at your lawn. Really look at it. Those low-growing, unround-leaved plants with the slightly scalloped edges that carpet shady patches and creep along sidewalk borders. There's a good chance some of them are mallow. Common mallow, Malva neglecta, and that species name, neglecta, tells you everything about how the modern world treats it. Neglected, overlooked, pulled up and discarded. But across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and North Africa, mallow has been eaten for thousands of years, with a reverence that would surprise anyone who just mowed over it. In Arabic, it's called kubeza, and it's a traditional cooked green that families prepare with garlic and olive oil. In parts of rural Turkey, Greece, and Lebanon, mallow leaves are still gathered as a seasonal staple. The ancient Romans ate it. Horace mentioned it in his writings as a simple, healthful food. The young seed pods, circular, flat, segmented like tiny wheels, are called cheeses in English folk tradition because they look like miniature cheese wheels, and children in rural England used to pick and eat them as snacks. What makes mallow special isn't a single dramatic compound, it's the mucilage. When you chew a mallow leaf, or more noticeably when you cook it, the plant releases a thick, slippery, gel-like substance, mucilage, that coats the mouth and throat with a soothing film. This is the same category of compound found in marshmallow root, aloe vera, and slippery elm. In fact, the original marshmallow confection was made from marshmallow plant root mucilage, mallow's close relative. Mucilaginous plants have a long traditional history of use for soothing irritated mucous membranes, which is a technical way of saying when your throat is raw, your stomach is upset, or your digestive tract is inflamed. Mucilage-rich plants have traditionally been the first thing people reached for. Modern research on demulcent herbs supports the mechanism. Mucilage forms a protective layer over irritated tissue, which can reduce contact with irritants and allow healing. One study on Malva sylvestris, a close relative, noted anti-inflammatory and gastroprotective properties in experimental models. The evidence base is primarily traditional and preclinical, not built on large human trials. But the mechanism is well understood, and the safety profile for food use is extensive. People have been eating this for millennia without issue. The leaves feel soft, almost velvety, like a puppy's ear. The flowers are small, pale pink, with delicate purple veins, and they're edible too. Mild, pretty, perfect for garnishing. Mallow grows in lawns, sidewalk cracks, garden borders, and at the edges of driveways. It stays low and spreading, easy to miss, easy to dismiss. The mucilage healer you can eat, your grandmother's sore throat remedy, and your great-grandmother's dinner side dish growing side by side in the same overlooked corner of the yard. If you're starting to realize how much is hiding in plain sight, you're exactly where you need to be. Keep going, because this next one carries battlefield credentials. Shepherd's purse, Capsella bursa pastoris, got its name from the tiny heart-shaped seed pods that hang along its stem like miniature leather pouches, the kind a medieval shepherd might carry coins in. It's a small, unassuming plant, rarely more than a foot tall, with a basal rosette of dandelion-like leaves and a thin flower stalk dotted with those distinctive little purses. You've seen it in sidewalk cracks, parking lot edges, garden paths. You've probably never given it a second look. Or soldiers did. European battlefield herbalism has a documented relationship with shepherd's purse that stretches back to at least the Middle Ages, and likely much earlier. The plant was used as a styptic, a substance applied to stop bleeding. Field medics, military herbalists, and rural healers reached for shepherd's purse when wounds were bleeding and pressure alone wasn't enough. During World War I, when conventional medical supplies ran short in some sectors, shepherd's purse was among the traditional European plants that saw renewed interest as an emergency hemostatic resource. And it wasn't just Europe. In traditional Chinese medicine, shepherd's purse is known as jikai, and it occupies a dual role that perfectly captures what this list is about. It's both a medicinal herb and a beloved edible green. In Shanghai and surrounding regions, jikai is a springtime delicacy. The young rosettes are harvested, chopped, and folded into wontons and dumplings with a flavor that's mildly peppery, slightly mustard-like, with an earthiness that tastes like the season turning. The same plant that stopped bleeding on medieval battlefields is stuffed into dumplings in Chinese kitchens. Modern pharmacological research has identified several compounds in shepherd's purse with hemostatic potential, including fumaric acid and flavonoids that may influence blood coagulation pathways. A number of studies have explored its traditional use as a uterine tonic, particularly in the context of heavy menstrual bleeding, a traditional application documented across European and Chinese systems. One pharmacological review described it as having demonstrated styptic and uterotonic properties in experimental settings. The evidence is stronger in traditional documentation than in large-scale clinical trials, and which means the honest framing is, centuries of battlefield and clinical herbalism agree this plant works for bleeding, and modern compound analysis has found plausible mechanisms, but the gold standard randomized controlled trials haven't yet been completed. That's a pattern you'll see throughout this list. Traditional systems running thousands of years ahead of research timelines. The young leaves have a crisp, peppery taste when eaten raw, like a milder arugula, and the texture is tender, and with thin leaves that wilt quickly after picking. The whole plant has a faintly green herbal scent when crushed. It grows almost everywhere humans disturb soil, worldwide. The field medic's styptic, hiding in the cracks of every sidewalk, carrying a dual passport, European wound care and Chinese cuisine, and waiting for someone to notice. And if that's surprising, wait until you hear what's growing in the desert. Prickly pear cactus, Opuntia, the genus with those flat, on paddle-shaped segments covered in spines and fine hair-like glochids that will remind you they exist for days after you touch them, is one of the most important food plants in the history of the Americas. And modern clinical research is starting to confirm what Mexican and indigenous communities have known for thousands of years. In Mexico, prickly pear pads, nopales, aren't exotic. They're Tuesday. They're grilled with onions and peppers, sliced into salads, scrambled with eggs, and stirred into soups. Nopals are sold in every market, every grocery store, every roadside stand. The fruit, called tuna, bright magenta or golden, sweet, juicy, filled with hard seeds, is eaten fresh, juiced, made into candy and syrup. This plant fed Mesoamerican civilizations for millennia and remains a daily dietary staple for millions of people right now. The Aztec founding myth literally centers on an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus. It's on the Mexican flag. But here's where it gets clinically interesting. Multiple studies have examined prickly pear's effects on blood sugar regulation, particularly in the context of type 2 diabetes. Research published in journals, including the Journal of Ethnopharmacology and Diabetes Care, has shown that nopal consumption may help lower post-meal blood glucose levels. The mucilage and fiber content of the pads appears to slow carbohydrate absorption, and certain compounds may influence insulin sensitivity. One clinical study noted that patients who consumed nopal along with a high-carbohydrate meal showed reduced glucose spikes compared to control groups. The evidence is promising enough that prickly pear is now the subject of ongoing clinical investigation as a dietary adjunct for metabolic health. This isn't a fringe claim, it's active research grounded in traditional observation. The cactus pads, once you navigate the spines and glochids, which are removed by scraping, burning, or peeling before cooking, have a mild, slightly tart, green bean-like flavor with a texture that's both crisp and slightly mucilaginous, similar to okra. The fruit bursts with sweetness, somewhere between watermelon and bubblegum, staining your fingers electric pink. The pads feel dense and waxy, with a weight that surprises you when you hold one. Prickly pear grows across the American Southwest, Mexico, the Mediterranean basin, parts of Africa, and increasingly in cultivation worldwide. It thrives in arid, poor soil where almost nothing else survives, which makes it not just a food and a medicine, but a food sovereignty plant, capable of feeding communities in the harshest conditions. The desert pharmacy you can grill. A plant that's been feeding people for 5,000 years, managing blood sugar in clinical trials, and growing where rain barely falls. And we're still not to the most powerful ones yet. If you're seeing the pattern, common, dismissed, are quietly extraordinary, good. Because this next plant was literally ranked number 1. Number 1. That's the ranking the Centers for Disease Control gave watercress when researchers evaluated 41 fruits and vegetables for nutrient density per calorie. Watercress, Nasturtium officinale, scored a perfect 100 on their powerhouse fruits and vegetables scale. Spinach scored 86, kale scored 49. Watercress beat every single commercially popular green on the market by a significant margin. And most people have never eaten it outside of a tea sandwich at a hotel brunch. That's a disconnect worth sitting with. Roman soldiers ate watercress. It was considered a vitality food, something you ate to stay sharp, strong, and alert on long campaigns. The Greek physician Hippocrates reportedly built his first hospital on the island of Kos, specifically near a stream, so he could grow fresh watercress for his patients. Whether that particular story is perfectly historical or partially mythologized, the underlying point is solid. Watercress has been considered medicinal food across European and Middle Eastern traditions for well over 2,000 years. In Victorian England, watercress was called poor man's bread because laborers who couldn't afford much else would buy penny bunches from watercress sellers, a specific street trade documented in Henry Mayhew's surveys of London's working poor. They ate it in handfuls like salad, sometimes the only fresh green in their diet, and it kept them alive. The peppery bite, that sharp, almost mustard-like kick when you bite a fresh sprig, comes from glucosinolates, specifically phenethyl isothiocyanate, or PEITC. This compound has become a focus of significant modern research. Studies published in journals, including the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, have examined PEITC's potential effects on cellular protection and detoxification pathways. One notable study found that watercress consumption increased measurable markers of antioxidant status in participants' blood within hours of eating it. The research is ongoing, and no one is claiming watercress cures disease. But the mechanistic evidence for its bioactive compounds is substantial and growing. Watercress grows in clean, slow-moving streams and spring-fed waterways. It forms dense floating mats of small, round, deep green leaves on hollow stems. The texture is succulent and crisp. Snap a stem, and it breaks cleanly, releasing a fresh, green, faintly peppery scent. The taste is bright and spicy, nothing like the mild greens most people eat daily. Finding it requires clean water, which is both a practical limitation and a kind of built-in quality indicator. On one critical safety note, wild watercress can harbor liver fluke parasites if it grows in water contaminated by livestock. Traditional foragers knew to harvest only from known clean sources. Modern foragers should follow that same wisdom. The original superfood, ranked number 1 by the CDC's own analysis, carried by Roman soldiers, sold on Victorian streets, growing in clean streams where nobody thinks to look. And we're only halfway through this list. If this is already shifting how you see the world outside your door, help spread it. Share this with someone who needs to know what's really growing out there. Let's leave the streams and move to the swamp, because the next plant on this list is arguably the most versatile wild food source in North America, and it looks like nothing more than a brown sausage on a stick. Cattail, Typha multiple species, grows in marshes, ponds, drainage ditches, and roadside wet areas across most of the world. You've driven past thousands of them. Those tall, sword-like leaves rising from shallow water, topped with the distinctive brown cylindrical seed heads that look like corn dogs. That's a supermarket disguised as a swamp plant. Nearly every part of a cattail is edible at some point during the year, and multiple cultures figured this out independently. Indigenous peoples across North America used cattails extensively. The young shoots in spring taste like mild cucumber when peeled, the immature flower heads can be boiled and eaten like corn on the cob, the pollen, that golden dust released in early summer, is a protein-rich flour that can be collected by shaking the heads into a bag, and the starchy rhizomes underground can be processed into a calorie-dense root starch year-round. Maori people in New Zealand use their native taifa species similarly. Raupo was a significant food and material resource. European traditions also documented cattail use, though less prominently in the culinary record. Survival manuals consistently rank cattail among the top wild food plants in the Northern Hemisphere. Its calorie per acre yield for the rhizome starch alone is estimated to rival cultivated crops. The pollen, when collected, has a rich golden color and a faintly sweet, earthy taste that blends into pancakes, bread, and porridge. The young shoots are crisp and watery, snapping cleanly between your teeth with a freshness that tastes like the pond smells in early spring. Clean, green, alive. Traditional uses extended beyond food. Cattail down, the fluffy seed material inside those brown heads, was used as wound dressing, insulation, and tinder. Some indigenous traditions used cattail root poultices on burns and skin irritations. A use documented in ethnobotanical literature, though not validated through clinical trials. The practical abundance is what makes cattail extraordinary. One plant provides flour, vegetable, pollen grain, and fiber material across 4 seasons. It's the swamp supermarket, open year-round, no membership required, stocked by nature. The leaves are long and flat, smooth on the surface with a slightly waxy feel, and they make a satisfying tearing sound when you strip them lengthwise. As the whole plant smells like fresh water and green growth, that distinctive wetland scent that tells you an ecosystem is healthy. You'll find cattails anywhere standing water meets sunlight. Pond edges, lake shores, marsh fringes, and those soggy ditches along country roads that nobody maintains. The swamp supermarket. And the next time you drive past one, you'll know you're looking at a 4-season wild grocery store that's been feeding people on multiple continents for longer than agriculture has existed. Now we're moving into territory that'll surprise you differently. A plant that changed how an entire continent brewed beer. Before hops dominated European brewing, before every pub pint carried that characteristic bitter floral bite, there was a completely different bittering herb running the show. Ground ivy, Glechoma hederaceae, also known in Old English as alehoof, which literally translates to ale herb. For centuries across Anglo-Saxon and medieval Northern Europe, ground ivy was the primary bittering agent in ale. Every village brewer, every monastery, every household that fermented grain used this creeping aromatic plant to balance sweetness and preserve the drink. The transition to hops happened gradually between the 13th and 16th centuries, driven partly by trade, and partly by preservation advantages hops offered, and partly by the politics of brewing guilds. When hops won, ground ivy was forgotten, not because it failed, but because trade routes changed. You're walking on it. Ground ivy is one of the most common lawn plants in temperate North America and Europe. It forms dense, low-growing mats with small, scalloped, kidney-shaped leaves and tiny purple flowers that appear in spring. Crush a leaf between your fingers, and you'll get a distinctive aromatic scent. Somewhere between mint and sage, pungent and herbal, unmistakably medicinal. The flavor follows the smell, bitter, complex, herbaceous. It's in the mint family, which explains the aromatic intensity, but it's wilder and more resinous than peppermint or spearmint. Traditional European herbalism valued ground ivy far beyond brewing. It was used as a respiratory herb, teas and infusions for coughs, chest congestion, asthma, and sinus complaints. The German herbal tradition, documented in texts going back to Hildegard of Bingen's era, includes ground ivy among its standard respiratory herbs. The compound that modern researchers have focused on is ursolic acid, a triterpenoid found in the leaves that has been studied for anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial, and antioxidant properties in laboratory settings. Research on ursolic acid spans dozens of studies, though most are preclinical, meaning the compound shows promise in cell and animal models, but large human clinical trials specific to ground ivy are limited. The honest framing, ground ivy's traditional reputation is extensive and consistent across multiple European herbal systems, and the identified compounds have documented biological activity, but the clinical evidence in humans is still catching up to the traditional record. The plant itself is low-growing and resilient. The leaves are soft, with a texture like fine felt, and the stems root at every node, spreading across lawns and shady ground with quiet persistence. You'll find it at the base of trees, along foundation walls, in shady patches of lawn, at forest edges. It thrives where grass struggles. The Saxon brewing herb, hiding in your shady side yard, carrying the aromatic memory of every ale brewed in England before hops arrived, and still offering the same compounds that made it a respiratory staple for centuries. If you've ever dealt with a stubborn cough in winter, your lawn might have had the traditional answer growing in it the whole time. This next one comes with a timeline that should make you pause. Garlic mustard, Aliaria petiolata, has been found in ceramic cooking vessel residue from archaeological sites in Denmark and Germany, dating to approximately 6,000 years ago. 6,000 years. That makes garlic mustard one of the oldest documented spice plants in European culinary history. Older than written language, older than the pyramids, older than the Bronze Age. Neolithic Europeans were deliberately cooking with this plant before they had metal tools. And today, in North America, garlic mustard is classified as one of the most problematic invasive species on the continent. Billions are spent attempting to control it. Volunteer groups organize weekend pulls. Conservation agencies issue urgent warnings about its spread through forest understories. All of that is ecologically valid. Garlic mustard disrupts native mycorrhizal fungal networks and can dominate forest floors at the expense of native wildflowers. The ecological concerns are real, but here's the part almost no one mentions in the same breath. It's delicious, and it's extraordinarily nutritious. The leaves, especially young ones harvested in early spring before the plant flowers, all have a bright, garlicky flavor with a slight bitterness, like arugula crossed with garlic chives. They can be eaten raw in salads, blended into pesto, wilted into pasta, or stirred into soups. The nutritional profile is impressive, high in vitamins A, C, and E, with significant mineral content. The garlic-like flavor comes from sulfur compounds, similar to those in actual garlic and other alliums, though garlic mustard is botanically in the mustard family. Not the allium family, a convergent evolution of flavor chemistry that happened independently. The leaves are bright green, roughly triangular to heart-shaped, with toothed edges. Crush them and the garlic scent rises immediately. Sharp, clean, unmistakable. The texture of young leaves is tender and slightly crisp, while older leaves toughen and intensify in bitterness. In its first year, garlic mustard grows as a low rosette of kidney-shaped leaves that overwinter. In its second year, it bolts into a tall, flowering stalk with white four-petaled flowers typical of the mustard family. The ecological argument creates a rare and beautiful alignment. Harvesting garlic mustard is actively encouraged by conservation organizations. You can forage this plant not just guilt-free, but with ecological virtue. Every plant you harvest is one fewer competing with native species. It's guilt-free foraging meets 6,000-year-old cuisine. On the invasive vitamin balm, a plant that Neolithic Europeans cooked with that carries a nutritional payload rivaling any cultivated green, and that conservation groups are begging you to eat. The pattern is undeniable now. 13 plants deep, and every single one was edible, documented, accessible, and dismissed. You've probably walked past most of them this week without knowing, and we're now entering the part of this list where things escalate from impressive to legendary. The plants coming next carry histories that read like epic novels. Stay with this, everything shifts now. The plants in this act aren't just edible, aren't just nutritious, aren't just traditionally valued. These are the ones with histories that span millennia, with modern research catching up in real time, with cultural weight that makes the previous entries feel like the warm-up they were. And we start with the one that stings. In stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, is a plant that announces itself with pain. Brush against it, and the hollow, hair-like trichomes on the stems and leaves act as hypodermic needles, injecting a cocktail of histamine, acetylcholine, serotonin, and formic acid into your skin. The sting is immediate, burning, tingling, insistent, and it leaves a raised welt that can last hours. This is a plant that fights back. And for the entirety of recorded human history, people have eaten it anyway, because the sting disappears completely with cooking, and what remains is one of the most nutrient-dense wild greens ever analyzed. Nettle has been a food staple across Europe for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence places it in Bronze Age settlements. During World War II, the British government ran active campaigns encouraging citizens to gather nettles for soup, published pamphlets, organized collection drives, because nettle greens provided iron, protein, calcium, and vitamins A and C during a time of severe rationing. Nettle soup wasn't desperation food, it was strategic nutrition endorsed by the Ministry of Health. The nutritional profile is remarkable: high iron, significant protein for a leafy green, silica, calcium, magnesium, and a spectrum of vitamins. The iron content alone made it a traditional remedy for fatigue and anemia across European folk medicine. The same application Curly Doc served are suggesting that traditional communities had sophisticated practical knowledge about mineral-rich plants long before blood tests existed. But nettle goes beyond nutrition into territory where clinical research has started generating significant attention. Studies on nettle leaf extract have examined its effects on allergic rhinitis, seasonal allergies. A randomized, double-blind study published in Planta Medica found that freeze-dried nettle leaf was rated effective by the majority of participants for allergy relief, performing better than placebo. The proposed mechanism involves the plant's ability to modulate histamine and inflammatory pathways, which carries a particular irony, given that histamine is one of the compounds in the sting itself. And the cultural history deepens further. Before cotton and linen dominated, nettle fiber was a major textile material. Bronze Age cloth made from nettle fiber has been found in European archaeological sites. The stems, when processed, yield a fine, strong fiber suitable for weaving. During World War I, Germany, facing cotton shortages due to blockades, revived nettle fiber production for military uniforms, a plant that feeds, clothes, and medicinally supports, all from the same stem. When you blanch nettle in boiling water for 30 seconds, the sting neutralizes. The cooked leaves taste earthy, rich, and green, like a deeper, more mineral-forward version of spinach with an almost brothy undertone. The raw leaves are dark green, deeply serrated, and covered with those visible stinging hairs that catch the light like tiny glass needles. The smell of cooking nettles is warm and vegetal, filling a kitchen the way good stock does. Nettle grows along riverbanks, in rich forest soil, at the edges of farms, on and in the shaded corners of old properties where nitrogen-rich soil accumulates. It forms tall, dense stands that can reach 5 feet by summer, and it spreads aggressively by rhizome. The sting that feeds nations, dismissed as a painful nuisance, studied in clinical allergy trials, carried by Bronze Age weavers and World War II nutritionists alike. This is what hiding in plain sight actually looks like. from a plant that stings to a plant that seduces with blue. Along every major highway, on every gravel shoulder, every railroad embankment in temperate North America and Europe, there's a tall, wiry plant with sky blue flowers that open each morning and close by afternoon. Most people assume it's a wildflower. It is. But chicory, Cichorium intybus, is also one of the most historically significant food and medicine plants in the Western world, and it's carrying a secret in its root that modern gut science is just now getting excited about. The root is the story. Roasted chicory root has been used as a coffee substitute and adulterant for centuries, and the tradition deepened during every crisis that disrupted coffee supply chains. During the American Civil War, Union naval blockades cut off coffee imports to the Confederacy. Soldiers and civilians throughout the South turned to roasted chicory root as a replacement, a practice that became so embedded in the culture of New Orleans that chicory coffee remains the signature drink of Café du Monde to this day. The same thing happened across Europe during World War II. When coffee became scarce, chicory root filled the gap. In both cases, people initially turned to it out of necessity and then kept drinking it because they developed a genuine taste for its rich, or a slightly woody, caramel-edged flavor. But here's where modern science enters the chat. Chicory root is one of the richest natural sources of inulin, a prebiotic fiber that feeds beneficial gut bacteria. And the explosion of gut microbiome research over the past 2 decades has turned inulin from an obscure botanical compound into a major focus of clinical nutrition. Studies published in journals, including the British Journal of Nutrition and Gut Microbes, have demonstrated that inulin supplementation can increase populations of beneficial bifidobacterium and lactobacillus species in the human gut. One systematic review described inulin as having convincing evidence for prebiotic effects. This matters because gut microbiome composition is now linked in research to everything from immune function to metabolic health to mood regulation. And chicory root has been providing this compound to human guts for centuries, long before anyone knew what a microbiome was. The leaves are edible too, bitter greens that have been cultivated into varieties like radicchio, endive, and Belgian endive, all of which are domesticated forms of wild chicory. The wild leaves are more intensely bitter, best when young or when blanched by shading, a technique European farmers have used for centuries to reduce bitterness in the cultivated varieties. On the plant itself is easy to identify. Tough, wiry stems with sparse lance-shaped leaves, and those unmistakable blue flowers that look like cornflowers perched on bare stalks. The root, when you dig it, thick, woody, pale inside, smells earthy and faintly sweet, and when roasted, fills a room with an aroma somewhere between coffee and chocolate. The texture of the raw root is dense and fibrous, snapping with effort. Find chicory along roadsides, in gravel, on sunny embankments. It loves disturbed, well-drained soil and full sun. The coffee rebel with a prebiotic secret, a plant that Confederate soldiers brewed under siege, that New Orleans turned into a cultural icon, and that modern gut microbiome research now validates as one of the richest sources of the exact fiber your intestinal bacteria are hungry for. It's growing in the gravel shoulder of the road you drive every day, and nobody charges you for it. Now, on if a plant that sustained armies through coffee shortages and feeds your gut microbiome at the same time isn't enough, the next one rewrites what you think you know about desert plants entirely. Some plants survived because they were too common to eradicate. This one survived because the desert itself protected it, and the people who lived there understood its power in ways colonization tried to erase. Mesquite, Prosopis, on several species, is a tree that cattle ranchers across the American Southwest spent the better part of the 20th century trying to destroy. They bulldozed it, burned it, poisoned it, chained it between tractors, and ripped it from the ground. Mesquite was the enemy, a thorny, water-hogging invader that turned grassland into scrub. Millions of dollars were spent on eradication programs. And during all of that, No one in the eradication campaigns stopped to ask the indigenous peoples of the region what they thought, because those communities already knew something the ranchers didn't. Mesquite was one of the most important food plants in the desert Southwest, and it had been for thousands of years. The Pima, the Tohono O'odham, the Comanche, the Apache, multiple nations across the arid Americas relied on mesquite pods as a dietary staple. The pods were harvested when ripe, dried, hulled, and ground into a sweet, nutty flour that could be stored for months and formed the caloric backbone of desert diets. Mesquite flour was eaten as a porridge, baked into cakes, dissolved into beverages. It was survival food in the truest sense: high calorie, high protein, high fiber, available in a landscape where almost nothing else produced food that reliably. And here's the modern kicker that makes nutritional researchers pay attention. Mesquite flour has a remarkably low glycemic index. And despite its natural sweetness, it tastes like a mix of molasses, cinnamon, and carob. It doesn't spike blood sugar the way refined flours and sugars do. Studies examining mesquite pod nutrition, including research published in the Plant Foods for Human Nutrition journal, have confirmed the low glycemic response and significant fiber and protein content. This has generated interest in mesquite flour as a potential functional food for metabolic health, particularly for communities disproportionately affected by type 2 diabetes, including some of the same indigenous communities that traditionally relied on mesquite before colonial food system disruption replaced it with processed flour and sugar. The irony cuts deep. The food that kept desert peoples healthy for millennia was systematically removed from the landscape and replaced with commodity crops that contributed to the very health crises now being studied. That's not a conspiracy. It's documented agricultural and public health history. The tree itself is tough, thorny, and beautiful in a desert way. Twisted trunks, fine-leafed canopy, long bean-like pods that rattle when dry. The pods smell sweet and warm, like a dessert spice. And the bark is rough and deeply furrowed. Mesquite wood, as many people know, is prized for smoking and grilling, producing that distinctive smoky sweet flavor associated with Texas barbecue. But the real treasure was always the pods, not the wood. You'll find mesquite across the American Southwest, Mexico, and parts of South America, Africa, and the Middle East where related species grow. The desert tree of life, a food so important it anchored entire civilizations. So nutritious that modern metabolic research validates its low glycemic profile, and so misunderstood that ranchers spent a century trying to annihilate it. The knowledge that mesquite pods were food didn't die, though. Indigenous communities maintained it, and now mesquite flour is showing up in specialty markets, in functional food research, and in food sovereignty movements that are reclaiming what was taken. This is what reclamation looks like when it has roots. Now for the plant that might deliver the biggest perception shock on this entire list: kudzu. Say that name in the American South, and people think of one thing: the vine that ate the South. Kudzu, Pueraria montana, was introduced to the United States from Japan in 1876 at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, and was later aggressively promoted by the Soil Conservation Service in the 1930s and 1940s as a ground cover to combat erosion. It worked too well. Kudzu grows up to a foot per day in warm conditions, smothering trees, covering abandoned buildings, draping over power lines in those eerie green blankets that look like nature reclaiming civilization in real time. It's become a symbol of invasive ecological disaster. And almost no one in America knows that in China, kudzu root, called gegen, has been used in traditional Chinese medicine for over 2,000 years. It's in the foundational TCM texts. The Shenong Ben Chao Jing, one of the oldest Chinese pharmacopoeias, lists kudzu root as a remedy for fever, thirst, diarrhea, and what was described as alcohol poisoning. That last application is the one that caught Harvard's attention. Researchers at McLean Hospital, affiliated with Harvard Medical School, conducted studies on portarin, a major isoflavone compound found in kudzu root, and its effects on alcohol consumption. Published in peer-reviewed journals including Alcoholism, Clinical and Experimental Research, the studies found that kudzu extract significantly reduced alcohol intake in heavy drinkers compared to placebo. The mechanism appears to involve effects on blood flow and possibly on dopamine pathways involved in reward processing. One study noted that participants who took kudzu extract before a drinking session consumed significantly fewer beers in a naturalistic laboratory setting. The research is preliminary. No one is calling kudzu a cure for alcohol dependence, but the results were striking enough to generate continued investigation and significant media attention. 2,000 years of traditional Chinese medicine said this plant addressed alcohol-related problems. Harvard researchers found measurable reductions in alcohol consumption. That's the kind of convergence between ancient observation and modern science that makes you wonder how many other traditional claims are sitting in pharmacopoeias waiting for someone to fund the trials. And here's the edible dimension most Americans never hear about. Kudzu is food. The young leaves can be cooked as greens or battered and fried. The flowers, those purple grape-scented clusters, are used in Chinese cooking and to make a traditional jelly. And the root starch is extracted and used as a thickener in East Asian cuisine. It's the original arrowroot in many Japanese recipes. The whole plant smells sweet when flowering, with that distinct grape candy fragrance that fills the southern air in late summer. The leaves are large, three-lobed, and fuzzy on the underside, soft as flannel when you run your hand across them. The vines are thick, woody, and astonishingly strong, capable of pulling down trees. Every part of this invasive nightmare is edible. 2,000 years of documented medicinal use. Clinical studies at one of the world's most prestigious medical institutions. And the plant is growing so aggressively across the American South that foraging it is essentially a public service. The invasive with 2 millennia of Chinese medicine behind it. And the American response was to see it only as a monster. The story of kudzu isn't just about a plant. It's about what happens when a culture encounters something foreign and refuses to learn from the culture that understood it first. And that theme, knowledge that was always there, waiting for people to pay attention, runs through everything on this list. And now, the most ironic plant on the entire countdown. The one that ties the bow on every single contrast we've been building. Dandelion, Taraxacum officinale. The most recognized, most sprayed, most cursed, and most underestimated plant in suburban America. People spend billions of dollars annually trying to kill dandelions. Herbicide companies have built marketing empires around the promise of a dandelion-free lawn. Homeowner associations penalize residents for dandelion presence. It is, by a wide margin, the most hated plant in the American yard, and every single part of it is edible, medicinally documented, and traditionally revered across multiple continents and thousands of years. Every part. The young leaves, those jagged, tooth-shaped greens that give the plant its name, from the French dent de lion, lion's tooth, are a salad green. Bitter, yes, in the way arugula is bitter, in the way radicchio is bitter, with a mineral depth that tastes like the earth it grows from. In France, Italy, Greece, and across the Mediterranean, dandelion greens are sold in markets as pissenlit salad, a name that translates indelicately but refers directly to the plant's well-documented traditional use as a diuretic. Traditional Chinese medicine includes dandelion, Pu Gong Ying, in its pharmacopoeia for what's described as heat-clearing and detoxifying functions. Native American traditions across multiple nations use dandelion as a food and tonic herb. European herbalists from the medieval period onward documented it extensively. This is not a plant that one culture discovered. It's a plant that every culture that encountered it independently decided was valuable. The flowers are edible, mild, slightly sweet, the basis of dandelion wine and dandelion fritters, both traditions that persist in rural communities across the Northern Hemisphere. The root, when roasted, produces a rich, dark, coffee-like beverage that has served as a caffeine-free alternative with its own robust following. And that root is where modern research gets particularly interested. Dandelion root contains inulin, the same prebiotic fiber we discussed with chicory, which makes sense because they're in the same botanical family. Preliminary in vitro research has examined taraxasterol and other compounds in dandelion root for potential effects on liver cell function and inflammatory markers. One study published in Food and Chemical Toxicology found that dandelion leaf extract showed antioxidant activity in experimental models. The research is early stage, in vitro and animal models, not large human trials, and the honest framing is that dandelion's traditional reputation significantly outpaces its clinical evidence base. But the traditional reputation spans the entire globe and thousands of years, which means the signal is strong even if the clinical confirmation is still catching up. The leaves taste best in early spring before flowering, when bitterness is milder. The root smells earthy and slightly sweet when fresh, and richly aromatic when roasted, like a cross between coffee and chocolate with a savory undertone. The flower smells faintly like honey. The seed head, that perfect white sphere you blew on as a child, is an engineering marvel. Each seed attached to a parachute of fine filaments that catch the wind with precision. You know where to find dandelion. It's in your lawn right now. It's in the crack of your driveway. It's at the edge of every parking lot, every playground, every neglected corner of every human landscape on Earth. The lawn enemy that's a complete meal. Leaves for salad, flowers for wine, roots for coffee, and a traditional medicine cabinet spanning every continent. The most versatile edible plant on this list is the one people spend the most money trying to destroy. Let that contrast sit with you as we move into the final act, because what comes next isn't about individual plants anymore. It's about how all of this changes the way you see. We've moved through 18 plants now, 18 edible, documented, traditionally valued species that most people walk past, mow over, pull up, or spray without a second thought. And if the pattern has landed, if you're starting to feel the weight of how much knowledge has been buried under convenience, then this final act is where that feeling crystallizes into something you can carry with you. Because the last two plants aren't just powerful on their own. They're symbols of everything this list has been building toward. And the first one might be growing in the crack of your driveway at this exact moment. Purslane, Portulaca oleracea, is a low-growing, succulent plant with thick, fleshy, paddle-shaped leaves and smooth, reddish stems that spread across hot, dry ground like it's claiming territory. It hugs the earth, radiating outward from a central point in a sprawling mat that can cover a square foot in a week. It grows in sidewalk cracks between pavers, in garden beds, in disturbed soil, in the spaces between everything else. Most people in North America and Northern Europe have no idea it's edible, and most of the rest of the world eats it regularly. Purslane is consumed across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, India, China, Mexico, and large parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. The World Health Organization has described it as one of the most widely consumed wild plants globally. In Greece, it's called andrakla or glistrida and is served in salads and stews. In Mexico, it's verdolaga, cooked with pork and tomatillos. In Chinese cuisine, it's maqijian, are stir-fried or included in dumpling fillings. And here's the nutritional fact that should stop you. Purslane contains the highest concentration of alpha-linolenic acid, an omega-3 fatty acid, of any leafy green ever tested. Omega-3s are the fats most associated with cardiovascular and brain health, the ones people buy expensive fish oil supplements and flax seed capsules to obtain. And the richest plant source is growing between the cracks of your patio for free. Research published in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition confirmed purslane's exceptional omega-3 content and its significant levels of vitamins A, C, and E, along with minerals including magnesium and potassium. Additional studies have noted antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds, including betalain pigments. the same class of compounds found in beets. The flavor is mild and slightly tangy, marred with a succulent crunch. The leaves pop between your teeth like tiny water balloons, releasing a taste that's somewhere between spinach and lemon with a faintly mucilaginous quality. The stems snap crisply. The texture is unique among greens. Nothing in the produce aisle feels like purslane. Squeeze a leaf and it's juicy, plump, with that unmistakable succulence that tells you this plant stores water and nutrients with an efficiency that lets it thrive where other plants can't survive. In traditional Chinese medicine, purslane has been used for skin conditions and digestive complaints. In Ayurvedic tradition, it appears as a cooling, soothing herb. In European folk medicine, it was applied topically for burns and insect bites. Multiple systems, multiple continents, multiple applications, all converging on the same small, fleshy plant that you've been stepping on. The most nutritious plant on Earth, by multiple measures and according to multiple analyses, is growing in the crack of your driveway. Not in a supplement bottle, not behind a pharmacy counter, not in a health food store at $12 for a handful, in a crack. For free. The omega-3 weed, a plant the entire world eats except the countries that paved over it and forgot. That's the gap this whole list has been illuminating, and it narrows with every plant you learn to recognize. The last plant on this list isn't one you'll find in a crack or a ditch. You'll find it in rich, moist forest soil in the mountains of eastern North America, usually in dense colonies under a canopy of hardwoods, often near streams, in the kind of deep shaded coves where spring arrives slowly and the air smells like cold earth and leaf mold. Ramps, Allium tricoccum, also called wild leeks, are the first wild edible of the Appalachian spring, emerging in late March and April when the forest floor is still brown and bare. They push up through the leaf litter as smooth, broad, lily-like leaves in pairs, with a deep green color and a reddish-purple stem that fades into a white bulb. Pull one gently from the soil and the scent hits you immediately. A pungent, garlicky, oniony blast that's stronger and more complex than anything from a grocery store produce section. It smells like wildness itself, like the forest deciding to remind you what flavor is supposed to be. For the Cherokee, the Ojibwe, and other indigenous peoples of eastern North America, ramps were among the most important spring tonic foods. After months of winter, when stored provisions were depleted and fresh greens were unavailable, ramps were the first nutrient-dense food to emerge from the ground. They were medicine in the most fundamental sense, not a treatment for disease, but a seasonal correction, fresh vitamins, on minerals and sulfur compounds entering the diet at exactly the moment the body needed them most. The concept of spring tonics runs deep in both indigenous and Appalachian folk traditions, and ramps were central to both. The name ramps may derive from ramson, an Old English word for a related wild garlic species, carried to Appalachia by settlers who recognized a familiar plant in a new landscape. Towns throughout West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina still hold annual ramp festivals, community events where ramps are the center of cooking, celebration, and cultural identity. Chicago's name is believed to derive from Shika-aqua, a word used by local indigenous peoples to describe the wild leeks that once grew prolifically along the shores of Lake Michigan, a plant so abundant and so valued that it named a city. The active compounds in ramps are similar to those in garlic and onions, allicin and other organosulfur compounds that have been extensively studied for cardiovascular support, antimicrobial properties, and anti-inflammatory effects. Research on allium compounds broadly, across garlic, onions, leeks, and wild relatives, represents one of the most robust bodies of evidence in plant pharmacology. Ramps haven't been studied in isolation as extensively as cultivated garlic, but the compound overlap means the mechanistic basis is well established. The flavor is a revelation if you've never tasted one. Sharper than scallions, deeper than garlic, with a sweetness that emerges when you cook the bulbs slowly in butter until they caramelize. The leaves are delicate, almost like thin fabric between your fingers, and they wilt within hours of picking. The bulbs are firm, smooth, and satisfying to clean, each one a tight white capsule of concentrated flavor. But here's the important closing note. Ramps grow slowly. It takes years for a colony to establish, and overharvesting has depleted populations in many areas. Several regions have enacted protection measures. Sustainable foraging means taking sparingly, a leaf from each plant rather than the whole bulb, harvesting from abundant patches rather than small colonies, and never taking more than a fraction of any stand. This is the right way to end this list. Not with the most powerful plant, but with the most honest lesson. Ramps represent everything this countdown has been about: ancestral knowledge that never actually disappeared, nutritional power hiding in wild places, modern science confirming what traditional cultures already knew, but they also represent the responsibility that comes with this knowledge. These plants aren't just resources, they're relationships. The communities that never lost this knowledge, the Cherokee families still digging ramps each spring, the Appalachian cooks still celebrating the festivals, the foragers who teach their children where and when and how much. They're not rediscovering anything, they're continuing what was never broken. The reclamation this list offers isn't about inventing something new. It's about remembering what was always there and treating it with the respect it deserves. Remember that parking lot from the beginning? The cracked asphalt behind the strip mall where amaranth was pushing through gravel, odd crimson stems rising from nothing, ignored by everyone walking past? Go back there now, in your mind. Pan across that same scene, but this time you know what you're looking at. The lamb's quarters along the fence line, wild spinach with more calcium than the cultivated kind. The purslane spreading in the sunny cracks, the omega-3 weed, eaten by hundreds of millions of people on 5 continents. The mallow creeping near the dumpster, the mucilage healer, a soothing guts across the Mediterranean for 3,000 years. The dandelion blooming defiantly through the concrete, every part edible, every continent's medicine cabinet, the most hated and most useful plant in the suburban world. The dock, the shepherd's purse, the garlic mustard at the tree line, every one of them named, every one of them known. The parking lot didn't change, you did. 20 plants, all edible, all documented across cultures and centuries. And all growing within reach of your daily life. Not one of them requires a prescription, a specialty store, or a flight to another country. They require knowledge, and knowledge, unlike a pharmacy, is free once you have it. This was never about telling you to stop seeing a doctor or throw away your medications. That would be irresponsible, and the plants themselves wouldn't endorse it if they could talk. This was about showing you that the line between weed and food is a line drawn by culture, not by nature. That the line between dismissed and documented is a line drawn by attention, not by reality. And that the knowledge your great-grandparents held, the knowledge soldiers carried, the knowledge that survived colonization and war and industrial agriculture never actually disappeared. It just went quiet. The plants kept growing. They always do. Next time you walk past a ditch, in a vacant lot, a neglected corner of the world that nobody curates or cultivates, look again. The pharmacy was never closed. You just learned the language,